Hi, I'm Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson, and I'm the author of DC Comics Before Superman, and you're watching Mr. Media.
Whatever you think you know about the 1930s origins of comic books, be prepared to learn a lot more. In her new book, DC Comics Before Superman, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson's Pulp Comics, my guest today, Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson, takes comics fans on a deep dive into the earliest days of the company we now know as DC Comics, but that started life in February 1935 as National Allied Publications. National Allied was founded by Nicky's grandfather, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, whose first comic was the accurately titled New Fun. Now, I learned all this just from the book's foreword, written by one of the genre's greatest modern masters as an artist and historian, Jim Steranko. And if you don't know Jim's work, you need to look him up right now. This book is both a history lesson and a repository of rare covers and interior pages published by the Major from 1935 to 1938, most of it extremely rare and almost impossible to find in its original form. The book is so cool that my wife, who is not a regular comic book reader, can't wait for this interview to be done so she can get back to reading it herself. Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Well, wait a minute. Comic books existed before Superman? Do tell.
Yes. Um, as I write in the book, so many people think of comic books as beginning with that action number one, the Superman comic. And a lot of people have not seen these early comics that came before Superman for 3 years. And because they are rare, they're not usually known, even by a lot of comics historians.
Well, and let's talk before we get into your grandfather's days. Let's
Sure.
talk, and this does sort of it all comes around. Let's talk a little bit about the origins of Superman comics. You have a rather unique view on how Clark Kent and company came to be.
Yes, and it goes against the grain. I've talked about it a lot with Laura Siegel, Jerry Siegel's daughter. And of course, she has a very particular point of view. And most historians have a point of view because the general story is that somebody, either Shelley Meyer or Vin Sullivan, Max Gaines, I think, has sometimes been said is the person who found the Superman comic in a slush pile. Now, a slush pile, for people who don't know publishing, is a pile of unread manuscripts,
Mm-hmm.
unsolicited unread manuscripts. And this is just not this is not accurate. The Superman script was not sitting around in anybody's slush pile. Laura and I, in talking about it, Laura brought up the fact that her dad was submitting Superman everywhere to everybody. So most people in that very small, close knit community knew about the script, and a lot of them had already turned it down. My grandfather really he thought it was an amazing script, and it was one of the things that attracted him to Siegel and Shuster. Now, my family story is that my grandfather was preparing Action One when the company was taken from him. And I just cannot document that fact. That is a family story. But the thing that does make sense to me is that it happened so suddenly. My grandfather said that they were working about 4 months in advance before an issue came out. So Superman came out, I think was it April 11th? I'm not sure of the exact day, but it was early April 1938 that Superman came out on the newsstands. Okay, if you backtrack, that ends up being December. My grandfather was still owner of the company in December. So he would have been working on that comic. that magazine. And that magazine was his idea, Action, which came from the pulp idea of action, adventure, detective. All of that came from the pulps. So I just have a feeling that there's more to this story that's going to be discovered, and I'm looking.
Well, I know from the years I spent working with Will Eisner as his biographer, he said that he had seen, and it's hard to know. He had seen at the Eisner Iger studio
Right.
the originals for Superman. But what I
Right.
found really that I didn't know, and that I found really interesting in your book, was that Siegel and Shuster, who created Superman in Cleveland, that part's all correct, but that they were working for your dad. I mean, they were producing comics, right?
Yes, he hired them.
Right.
This is what I love about Jerry Siegel. He was really young, and yet he was very savvy. He knew about my grandfather from pulps because he was a big Pulp Fiction fan. And so when he saw that that scripts and comics were being solicited for these new comics, he sent a couple of ideas. And one of the things he sent was a drawing of Superman on either butcher paper or some sort of, grocery bag paper, that kind of thing, along with Dr. Occult and Henri Duval. And and that was very, very smart because my grandfather wrote a lot of swashbucklers. So he would naturally be attracted to the idea of Henry Duval. And so the story is that my grandfather didn't throw, as Jerry Siegel himself wrote about in his biography. He said that because my grandfather did not throw away this piece of paper with Superman drawing on it and their other drawings, and wrote to them and said that he would take the Henry Duval and he would take Dr. Occult, and then he made suggestions to them for other comics that he thought they should do, and he also made suggestions to them about Superman.
I've got to ask you, does that butcher block drawing of Superman still exist?
I think so. At one point, where I saw it in a history book at one point, and I'm sorry, I just cannot remember. I can't remember.
But you think somebody has it somewhere?
I think so.
Wow.
I think so.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, though. Generally, and maybe I'm wrong about this. I'm not. I don't remember every detail of comics lore.
Yeah.
Sorry, comics fans.
Me either.
Yeah. But my sense has always been, the story has always been told about Siegel and Shuster, that they had sent this Superman idea out, and they were working from home or they were working from Cleveland, right, and that this was their big break. Well, yeah, but they were doing comics several years before, and that was something that never came up in talking to Eisner. He always just talked about it, that they were these nobodies who were doing. But they weren't. I mean, and you've got examples of their work in this book, and I think that's fascinating. Is it just me? I mean, is that well known that they were doing this work for your dad?
Grandfather.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. I would think so, but apparently not. And I think that's part of the problem with why my grandfather's legacy has not been has just not been in comics history and comics lore that much. But yeah, they were working. The first New Fun came out it was on the newsstands in January 1935, and they started working for him. I think the first time they sent something to him was in March 1935, and then they were in October 1935 his comics magazine. So from October 1935 on, They were working for him,
Hmm.
doing a number of comics. And I really love those early comics of theirs. I think some of Joe Shuster's best art is in those early comics.
Hmm.
Before he was so pressured by turning out Superman.
Right. There's a great quote. I love this in the book. You say there was only one person who believed in Superman from the very beginning, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson.
Yes, that's
Right?
true.
I mean, just and you back it up, and while I know you acknowledge you don't have this absolute proof that he created Action Number One, there seems to be a lot of circumstantial evidence.
Yes.
Uh,
And I have I don't do this by myself. I have a number of really great guys that support the work that I do, that I constantly check, because there's some guys who've been studying this history for most of their lives.
mhm.
They've been collectors and they've studied the history, and they know a lot about many different aspects. And so I'll check with them about things, and I'll get a piece of something and a piece of something else, and then realize, okay, well, this seems to lead in this direction.
So, what got you interested in this? Was it protecting the family legacy? Are you a comics fan, a comics person? Where do how do you take interest in all this?
It's kind of an odd story. I grew up loving comics like all kids, and my maternal grandmother used to take us to the local drugstore, and we'd get a cherry Coke and pick out comics that we wanted and read them. And I loved the Sunday comics. I was a big fan of Pogo. And I didn't know till much later that Walt Kelly, one of his first appearances, was in my grandfather's early
Oh
comics.
wow.
Yeah. Um, but I didn't really, I mean, I wasn't, like the typical comic book fan. I mean, they were just sort of there, in the 60s. I like everybody else, I loved underground comics and that kind of thing. And Howard Cruz is a very close friend of mine.
Hmm.
We both went to college in Birmingham Southern, and we've known each other our whole adult lives. And so I've always been aware of certain aspects of comics, but I'm basically your Jane Austen type of girl. And my master's degree is in the divine feminine in classical Greek mythology.
Oh sure, I spent a lot of time in that.
Yes, right. Very practical. Uh, but my mother worked for the United Nations. I'm originally from the Gulf Coast,
Hmm.
and my mother worked for the United Nations when it first began out on Long Island. And she rented the top floor of the Major and Ilsa's house in Great Neck. And she met my father, and they got married. But the marriage didn't last, and they were divorced. And I really did not know that side of my family until I was an adult. And when I came back into the family, my grandfather had passed away.
Oh.
My grandmother was still living, and all my aunts and my uncle and my dad, of course, were still there. And because I had not been in the family, they wanted me to know as much of the family history as possible. So I ended up with a lot of what was left of the archival information, letters and photographs and that kind of thing, because I showed such an interest in it. And then at some point much later, I didn't realize what my father had given me until about 1997. I got a pulp of one of my grandfather's pulps, and I loved it. I just loved it because I'm a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I just tuned in to that part of him as a writer, and that set me off. And once I got going, the whole thing opened up, and I suddenly became a comics historian.
And so it's interesting. I was going to ask you later. So you never did meet uh, Malcolm?
No, I never met the major.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's um in some ways it's better because I don't, even though I'm a family member, I don't have that filter of looking at him. Of course, he's my grandfather and I really care and I think he's an amazing person,
Hmm.
but I don't have any of the baggage from having grown up in the family.
Right. Yeah, it's
So,
interesting because in the book you refer to him in the third person. Well, maybe that's not the best way to put it, but as Wheeler-Nicholson. And there were a couple of times I stopped and went, "Well, okay, but it's your grandfather." But if you've never met him and you have to somewhat dispassionately write a book like this.
right,
Obviously, you're passionate. You have a point of view. He was your grandfather,
right,
but so that
right.
that always was interesting. Did you? And I have to ask you, as a writer, did you wrestle a bit with how to reference him?
Yes, yes,
And how did
yes.
you land on Wheeler Nicholson as opposed to my grandfather this or my grandfather that or the major this, the major that?
Well, I do reference him in various ways. It's a little bit subtle. Originally, when he was younger, when I talk about him as a young person, I usually refer to him as Malcolm. And then when after he went to Manlius, he got the nickname, interestingly, of Nick. And out of 20 grandchildren, I am the only grandchild who is
Oh,
Nicky. And that happened without any connection
wow.
to my father or my family. And then I usually refer to him as the major once I get into the comics. And I
Right.
refer to him as Wheeler Nicholson sometimes because as a family member, there's a certain suspicion that I don't know what I'm talking about and that I haven't that I haven't done my research.
Mm,
And so I do try to keep some distance, even though sometimes I do refer to him as my grandfather.
okay.
So I don't know, that's kind of crazy.
No, that's a good explanation, and it makes sense in terms of certainly the periods of time and where he was at. I do recall now that we're discussing it that he was Malcolm in the early days, and I remember at the end he's Wheeler Nicholson. But I do remember seeing that he was referred to occasionally as the Major, and that always struck me because my father-in-law, who was a 30-year Army colonel, only wanted to be referred to as the Colonel. So
Yeah.
my mother-in-law would say, "Go get the colonel for dinner, Bob," or he would want me to address him as Colonel. What do you think about, or
Yes.
And I thought it was just in the family until he took me to the officers' club at MacDill Air Force Base after several years to introduce me to his buddies, and they all referred to him as the Colonel, and I thought, well, they're all officers, and they're calling him the
Right.
Colonel, so the Major. I related to that. I get that kind of. But it's still, I mean, I think you indicate you spent 20 years putting this project together.
Yes. Yes.
What took so long? And
Yeah.
what was the toughest part of getting it done?
Um, Part of it is that I had to make a living and I couldn't devote my time completely to this. So I had to do it off and on between other projects.
Hmm.
And I think also part of it was I I just wasn't ready.
Hmm.
I didn't feel that I knew enough because it's you know the subject of early comics and Superman and all of that is pretty there are a lot of people who have been studying that for a long time, who are well known. And as a woman, also, I felt I was somewhat hesitant to just say, okay, I have a different view of this, and here it is. So I really wanted to make sure that I knew what I was talking about and that I had researched it very carefully before I put it out there. But I feel like the time is right, and I feel good about it, and I'm pretty excited.
I remember I hate to come back to this, but I think it's appropriate here. I spent 3 years working with Will Eisner until he died on his biography, and thought I'd been incredibly thorough, interviewed 75, 100 people, and we talked about all kinds of things. And then, let's see, that book came out in 2005. 2014, I guess, Ken Quattro, who we both know, is known as the comics detective,
Right.
publishes this archive of documents about the lawsuit that Will Eisner was
Oh,
involved
right.
with about Wonder Man, and suddenly I realized that, as careful as I tried to be, there were things that just weren't true that Will had said, and the documents bore
Right.
out. So we had to go. I went in and we did an updated edition where we acknowledged that this thing's, and you can see a line there too from National Allied to National Detective Comics,
Right.
and Victor Fox, who got
Yes.
involved, right? And it all connects, and
Yes.
it's that
Yes.
whole aspect of this was an industry that was rife with gangsters and
Yes.
illegal financing over,
Right.
I remember Will said that people who worked in comics were just below pornographers at the time, and by pornographers, I think he was talking about publishers of pulps, for example, because
Right.
that was
Right.
very adult. So I could understand. I could understand wanting to take your time. Also, researching things in the comics industry is not like researching things
No.
elsewhere.
No.
The official record is a very fluid thing. Um,
Yes.
uh, what were some of the hazards and what were some of the challenges in terms of doing the research?
Well, because I did not, because I didn't have my grandfather to depend on for his point of view, in a way that is something that I miss a lot. But on the other hand, I was free to explore things on my own without having that voice. And part of the challenge is that so much of what is considered the basics of comic book history is based on what people said. And there's not a lot of documentation. So you have all these different people who maybe later in their lives are telling these stories about what they say happened. And you have to go back and find, it's almost like being, it's almost like a murder mystery in a way. The body is not there, and and the gun's not there, and you have to figure out, okay, if the body was here, then that means, and so what I have relied on a lot have been those legal documents from court cases, because a lot of the things that people said in court are quite different from the stories that they told later. And there are a lot of court cases. There's the whole slew of Siegel and Shuster's court case. There's the court case you're referring to. And there's also, in my grandfather's case, there was the bankruptcy, which it took me 10 years to find that court case. And when I finally found it, it is 600 legal pages long. Wow. It's astonishing. And it's an amazing, amazing record of what happened and who did what. And it's incredible.
Wow. And how many of the original comics were you able to lay your hands on?
Not that many.
Mm.
My family no longer had them. This is really horrible. There was a barn fire.
Oh
In,
no.
oh
God, I
yeah,
hate those stories.
oh yeah, in the 60s, and the comics,
Oh,
my grandfather's original scripts, a
oh,
lot of letters, you know, uh, poof. And
wow.
um, so I had to rely on the generosity of a lot of collectors, and these guys have been great. And I'm going to say, particularly, David Armstrong had so much to do with the way the book came out because he's a collector and he had the most of the pages that we used in the book.
Oh. So,
So
and he wrote the epilogue,
yes,
David,
the
right?
afterward.
The afterward, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. David has done a phenomenal job for the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years interviewing a lot of the early uh, artists uh, at Comic-Con
Hmm.
and in other places. So he has recordings of these guys talking about that period.
Now,
Oh,
your grandfather was a writer before he became a publisher. He wrote for
right.
the pulps. He wrote all kinds of things. Uh, you are a writer. Was your dad or anyone in between you and your grandfather? Did anyone else write in the family?
I come from writers on both sides.
Oh,
My mother wrote, and she was involved in publishing. And my dad didn't write. He was a really good writer, but he never pursued it professionally.
hmm.
Um, and you know, so it's basically from my mom and. Uh, my Wheeler-Nicholson family is my great grandmother, the Major's mother, was also a writer,
Oh,
and her father started a newspaper in Jonesboro, Tennessee, right after the Civil War that's still in existence today. So both sides of my family are involved in journalism and publishing and writing. So I come by it naturally.
why don't we tell folks just a little bit about the Major himself? I recall he was born in 1890, right?
Right. Hmm.
And he actually was a major. It
Yes,
was
he
very
was.
controversial the end of his military career, but
Yes.
just if you want to just give folks just a nickel's worth of background on who the
Okay.
major was.
Um, he was born in 1890 near Greenville, Tennessee, in East Tennessee, which is near North Carolina and Virginia in the mountains. Very beautiful country. And when he was about 7 or 8 years old, his mother took the two boys and moved across the country to Portland, Oregon, because his father, whose name, he had the unusual name of Lola Orlando Strain or Strawn, and he abandoned the family. And so my great grandmother, in a time when women were not outside of the home, she just up and took these boys to Portland, Oregon, and she established herself as a writer. She started writing for newspapers there. So he grew up there from the time of about 8 or so. And my great grandmother remarried Thomas J. Bell Nicholson, who was a wonderful Englishman and very beloved by everyone. And so my grandfather took his name. And the reason the name is hyphenated is the maternal, my great grandmother's father was a Wheeler. And when she married Nicholson, she became Wheeler Nicholson in the way of suffragettes because she was a suffragette.
Oh,
Um, so he went to school back east at St. John's Military Academy in Manlius, New York, and that was a feeder school for the U.S. Army. So he went into the Army in 1912 as a classic second lieutenant, shaved tail, And he started out under General Pershing on the Mexican border, chasing bandits and Pancho Villa. And he always wanted to command one of the African American Buffalo Soldiers units. And at the time, that was considered kind of a punishment, but he kept asking for it. And they finally let him have it in 1914. He took a troop of African American Buffalo Soldiers to the Philippines, and they were still doing mop-up operations from the Moro Wars in the Philippines. And then he went to Siberia as in military intelligence during World War One, just prior to when the U.S. got into World War One. So he was in Japan and China and some Siberia. He had a secret mission on the Mongolian border to China. I mean, his adventures in the military were quite something.
Wow.
And after the military, he started writing what is referred to as pulp fiction, but not what most people think of as the 1950s paperbacks, but pulp fiction that was really popular and ranged from kind of sleazy stuff like spicy detective to just general things, adventure. And he wrote for the adventure stories.
Well, the pulps were also the origin of a lot of things that comic books took. The Shadow originated there, Doc Savage,
Right.
the Spider.
Right.
I'm sure if I could think for a minute, I'd think of a whole bunch more. I know my wife and I have picked up where we've seen them from time to time. We've got a small collection of the original pulps on the shelf. I'm looking across the room at the shelf that has those on it. And they were called pulps because the paper was just so pulpy. It was just
Right.
so,
Right.
it did not hold up well over the years.
Yes, when I purchase a number of my grandfather's pulps, and when I get them, I copy them so that I can work with them, because trying to deal with these things, they just crumble. It's really.
Yeah. It's sad. I know my wife was like, "Well, why can't I read them?" I said, "Well, open one, you'll see." It's like,
Right.
yeah, it's not good that way. And I'm imagining, since we're not able to actually lay your hands on the original comics, that the art that we see is taken from comic pages, as opposed to the original art for these pages probably is not in existence for the most part.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Uh,
That was an interesting aspect in the bankruptcy case, because the lawyers for Siegel, for Donenfeld and Leibowitz, uh, did not want to pay the artist for as freelancers, as individual. They wanted them to be works for hire, and my grandfather said no, they have to be paid as freelancers, as individual artists, and they own the artwork.
and of course, that was not the way that the industry went. The industry went the way that
No,
Donenfeld and Leibowitz wanted it to, and
no.
it was decades before the artists would eventually come to own their art and own a
Right.
piece of it. Yeah, that's sad. I wanted to point out to people, if you're interested and curious about the art in these books, a lot of it I would describe. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of it I would describe for someone younger who hasn't seen this type of stuff. If you've seen the Prince Valiant strips in the Sunday Funnies in today's newspapers, it's that style. It's kind of a classic looking style. Most of it, some of it's a little less uh, elegant, let's say. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of it that it's in that style, and it's extraordinary to look at. Whether it's the Joe Shuster's drawings or some of the other artists, it's very, very cool.
Well, that's because a lot of the people that were hired were illustrators.
Hmm.
So they were coming from an art background. Some of the people that were working for my grandfather were well known artists and illustrators. And because it was the Depression, they were just really glad to be able to make a living and to be paid for their artwork.
Now, I don't want to I don't want to go into much really about how your grandfather's ownership of National Allied ended. Let's just say
Right.
it ended badly. It's not it's a nonfiction book, but it has, if I give away the ending, I think it takes away something from it. But let's just say it did not end happily, and it's
Right.
a story that's still in contention. And it must have been it must have been hard for you to think about what might have been had he held on to it.
Well, I think more for me, I don't quite have that sense of things. I think the rest of my family does. There's a real bitterness. When I first started hearing about my grandfather's story, it was always told to me in a way that he lost it, it was taken. There's a I think there's definitely a bitterness and we could have been this kind of thing. And I don't quite feel that way. It makes me sad because it meant so much to him. But in terms of what could have been, I don't really focus on that because these things happen in life, and particularly when you're in any kind of artistic endeavor, it's fairly typical that the person who actually is the creator often doesn't end up with it.
Yeah, and it's true.
It's
And
pretty
in that period of time, pardon me, in that period of time too, you had to really have some business sense and extra business sense, I think, to survive and thrive. And your grandfather was a creative person. It
right,
seems like, from what we know of him, he was a good-hearted person.
right.
I think he passed in 1965.
1965, he was 75 years old. He
Mm,
had a massive heart attack,
mm.
and he had had heart trouble, but that 1965, September of 1965. I found just the other day something that I had not read that Dwight Zimmerman, who's a wonderful comics historian and also a military historian,
Mm.
sent me, and I had never really looked at it carefully. And it was an interview that Dwight did with Jack Leibowitz. And I hadn't really read it thoroughly, and I was reading it the other day, and in it, Jack Leibowitz describes my grandfather like this. I should have it in front of me to quote exactly, but it was something to the effect of that Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson was a fine gentleman, not a good businessman, and he was different from the kind of people you find in publishing. That was how he put it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty good. Different.
Really interesting. What in the world? I just had the funniest thing happen. The TV in the background just went on without anybody touching a button. That was weird. Sorry to interrupt, but
That's okay.
suddenly a soap opera was playing in the background. So we've actually bookended because when we started this thing, Alexa started talking to us, and now this is a creepy house. Don't buy this house, folks. Listen, folks. On that strange ending, you can find Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson's new book, DC Comics Before Superman, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson's Pulp Comics, in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price from MrMedia.com. If you are watching this interview on MrMedia.com, just below the video, you will see the cover of the book. You can click on it. It'll take you to Amazon. Go ahead and order it there. And I understand with drones and everything, you can have it in 30 minutes or less. No, I'm just kidding. Nikki, do you have a website you want to direct people to?
Yes. There's the Major has a website, MajorMalcolmWheelerNicholson.com. There's not another one like it. And the Major also has a page on Facebook, and people can communicate with me through the website and through Facebook. And I'm on Twitter and Goodreads. And so I love to hear from people, especially people who've read the book and who have questions and want to know more about the major.
It's amazing that the major had such foresight that even though he passed in 1965, he managed to secure his domain name for use when something called the internet was created 25 to 30 years later.
How about that?
That guy, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson, it was a pleasure to finally see the fruit of your labor. It's a beautiful book, great stories in it.
Thank you.
And I wish you all the best. And thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it.
Turn your back on the deceiver. It's a bad idea to believe her. A bad idea to believe her. Turn up the stereo receiver. Turn up the stereo receiver.